The trousers that shocked Victorian England. The fog came first, as it always seemed to in London, thick, yellow-grey, rolling low over the cobblestones like a living thing. Gas lamps burned weakly through it, their halos trembling in the damp air. Carriage wheels hissed through puddles. Somewhere, a vendor called out the morning's papers, his voice swallowed by soot and mist. And then she appeared. A woman stepped out from the shadow of a narrow street near Holborn, her posture upright, her pace unhurried. At first, the passers-by registered only the outline, a figure moving alone, purposeful. Then the fog shifted, and the shape of her clothing sharpened. Not a skirt. Not petticoats. Not the familiar sweep of fabric that marked Victorian womanhood like a flag. She was wearing trousers. The effect was immediate. A man halted mid-step. A maid's hand flew to her mouth. A clerk stared as if his eyes had betrayed him. Silence spread in ripples, broken only by the distant clatter of hooves. It was not simply that the outfit looked strange. It was that it violated something deeper than fashion. It challenged the invisible architecture of the world, the unspoken laws about who a woman was allowed to be, how she was allowed to move, what space she was allowed to occupy. In Victorian England, clothing was never just clothing. It was control made visible. The Victorian uniform of womanhood. To understand why trousers could cause such shock, one must understand what Victorian dress represented. A respectable woman in mid-19th century Britain was wrapped, almost literally, in layers of expectation. The silhouette of femininity was constructed through fabric, chemise, corset, petticoats, crinolines, outer skirts. Clothing was designed not for speed, not for comfort, not for freedom, but for display and discipline. The ideal woman was ornamental, contained, domestic. Her clothes enforced that ideal. A corset restricted breathing and posture. Long skirts limited stride length. Heavy fabric made running nearly impossible. Even entering a carriage required assistance. This was not accidental. Victorian gender ideology separated the world into spheres. The public sphere of politics, commerce, and labor belonged to men. The private sphere of home and morality belonged to women. Dress was one of the most powerful tools in maintaining that separation. Mobility was power. Trousers symbolized mobility. And mobility symbolized independence. The fear of a woman who could move. Modern readers sometimes underestimate how radical trousers seemed in the 1800s. Today, pants are mundane. But in Victorian England, they were unmistakably masculine. They belonged to soldiers, factory workers, writers, businessmen, men who moved freely through streets and institutions. For a woman to wear trousers was not simply to change her outfit. It was to trespass. It blurred the line between genders at a time when society depended on that line being sharp. Many Victorians believed that clothing reflected natural order. A woman in trousers was, to some, a contradiction, an unsettling disruption of God's design. Newspapers mocked such women as grotesque. Cartoonists exaggerated them into caricatures, broad-shouldered, aggressive, unfeminine. The fear was not really about fabric. It was about what fabric represented. If a woman could dress like a man, could she also vote like a man? Work like a man? Walk alone like a man? The trousers became a symbol of a much larger rebellion. Dress reform and the first trousered women. The most famous early advocate for women's trousers was not British, but American, Amelia Bloomer. Bloomer was a journalist, editor, and women's rights activist in the mid-19th century. In 1851, she popularized a style of dress that would become forever linked with her name, the Bloomer costume. This outfit consisted of a shortened dress worn over loose trousers gathered at the ankle, often resembling Turkish-style pants. The design was intended to free women from the weight and restriction of long skirts. Importantly, Amelia Bloomer did not invent the garment. Variations of trousered dress had appeared earlier, influenced by Middle Eastern clothing and by practical needs such as exercise or health. What Bloomer did was amplify it. Through her publication The Lily, she praised the outfit as rational, healthy, and liberating. The Bloomer costume quickly spread among women's rights circles in the United States and drew enormous attention, much of it hostile. Victorian culture on both sides of the Atlantic responded with ridicule bordering on obsession. The bloomer became a lightning rod. The British reaction, mockery, not mass adoption in Britain. The bloomer costume was known, discussed, and sometimes worn by reform-minded women. But it never became widespread. Because the backlash was ferocious. Women who wore bloomers reported being laughed at, stared at, followed in the street. Some accounts describe crowds gathering, jeering, even throwing insults. It was not illegal, strictly speaking, for women to wear trousers in Victorian England. There was no universal law banning it. But the force of social punishment could be as powerful as law. A woman in trousers risked her reputation. And in Victorian society, reputation was everything. Respectability determined whether one could find employment, marry well, move safely through public space. To lose it was to become vulnerable. Thus, trousers were not simply unfashionable. They were dangerous. Arrests, myth versus documented fact. Popular retellings often claim that women were routinely arrested simply for wearing trousers. The reality is more complicated. There are documented cases in the broader 19th century, particularly later, and often outside Britain, of women being detained under public decency laws or for cross-dressing. In some places, laws explicitly prohibited dressing as the opposite sex. However, in Victorian England specifically, clear records of women being formally arrested solely for trousers are rare. What is verified is this: women wearing bloomer-style dress often faced harassment. Police sometimes intervened if crowds became disorderly. Social backlash was intense enough to discourage most women from adopting reform dress. The idea of widespread arrests is likely exaggerated by later storytelling, which compresses social repression into dramatic legal punishment. Victorian society did not always need prisons to enforce gender norms. Shame was often enough. Why trousers were political: to wear trousers was to claim something Victorian femininity denied: physical autonomy. A woman in trousers could walk farther, faster. She could climb stairs without lifting skirts. She could ride a bicycle, work more easily, move without constant management of fabric. Mobility may seem trivial until it is restricted. But when half the population is dressed in a way that makes running difficult, public movement becomes subtly policed. Dress reformers understood this. They argued that clothing was not merely aesthetic but structural. Restrictive dress contributed to poor health, limited employment, and reinforced dependency. The bloomer costume was part of a broader feminist vision: women as active citizens rather than decorative dependents. That was why it frightened people. The decline of the bloomer, and the persistence of the idea. Interestingly, Amelia Bloomer herself eventually stopped wearing bloomers. Not because she abandoned the principle, but because the controversy became a distraction. The clothing overshadowed the cause. Many reformers concluded that society was not ready. They shifted focus to suffrage, education, legal rights. Yet the seed was planted. The question had been asked publicly: why should clothing imprison women? The bicycle revolution. Trousers returned later in the 19th century. Trousers re-emerged through an unexpected vehicle of change: the bicycle. In the 1890s, cycling became wildly popular among women, offering unprecedented freedom of movement. But cycling in long skirts was dangerous. Fabric could catch in wheels. Practicality demanded reform. Women began wearing divided skirts, knickerbockers, and other trouser-like garments for sport. Once again, moral panic erupted. Critics claimed bicycles and trousers would destroy femininity, health, even fertility. Yet the bicycle could not be uninvented. And neither could the idea of women moving freely through the world. The long shadow of a trousered step, that foggy London street, that stunned silence, that moment of transgression, whether it happened exactly as imagined or in countless similar forms, captures something real. Victorian England was a society obsessed with appearances because appearances maintained order. To change clothing was to change meaning. Trousers were not simply garments. They were symbols of a woman refusing containment. The first women who dared to wear them did not topple the empire overnight. They were mocked more often than celebrated. They retreated sometimes, regrouped, redirected their rebellion into other arenas. But every revolution begins with someone stepping across a line. Sometimes that line is drawn in law. Sometimes it is drawn in fabric. And sometimes, in the thick London fog, it begins with the quiet, shocking sound of a woman walking freely, her stride unbroken, her trousers whispering against the cobblestones like a promise of what was coming.